In a speedrun, when a cutscene can be skipped by some means, it's often fastest to do so. Sometimes this is done via pretty involved means, such as voiding out after hitting a cutscene trigger, or pause buffering all the way through a cutscene trigger to a load zone. Even though these cutscene skips take some time to execute, they save time over watching the cutscenes that they skip. Skipping a cutscene is especially worthwhile when it can be done more simply, such as by avoiding a cutscene trigger altogether by moving around it. My main speed game, Twilight Princess, features quite a bit of simple cutscene skipping on account of being able to skip many cutscenes just by pressing start. Not only is skipping cutscenes fast, it's also, in my opinion, much more fun than watching cutscenes, at least in the context of doing a speedrun. There are some great cutscenes in Zelda games, but most of the time I'd rather be in control and trying to do something fast that I practiced than be twiddling my thumbs. Over the years, it's occasionally occurred to me to wonder how much time I spend during a speedrun not doing anything at all. Since so many cutscenes can be skipped in Twilight Princess, I rarely feel like a run of it is overwhelmingly full of cutscenes, but I have speedrun some other 3D Zeldas. Majora's Mask is notorious for its first cycle, the extremely cutscene-dense section of the game prior to receiving the Deku Mask. As a matter of fact, I usually eschew the leaderboard and skip first cycle entirely when I run shorter categories of Majora's Mask, by starting with a file saved right after getting the Deku Mask. You can do that, the speedrun police won't arrest you. But the speedrun that piqued my interest was the Wind Waker glitchless any %. I ran this very briefly last year and felt like I was watching a feature film every run. So I gave in and tallied up how much downtime there was in the run, and it turns out I was watching a feature film every run, and a fairly long one at that. Without more data, there was no way to know whether this category was as much of an outlier as it felt like, so I collected some more data on the most boring parts of speedruns, and now I'm going to tell you about it. Isn't that a great idea for a video? My goal was to determine for various speedrun categories of all the 3D Zelda games what percentage of a run was downtime. So to start off, we'll need to go over the reasonably strict definition of downtime that I came up with for data collection purposes. After that, we'll take a look at the numbers and some interesting stuff that came up along the way in each game, including the neat ways downtime can be avoided or used to a runner's advantage, and then we can consider what the numbers mean, if anything. So what counts as downtime? To me, downtime is time when I can progress in my speedrun absent-mindedly without any chance of losing time. Loads count, and cutscenes count when no input can do anything at all except skip the cutscene or advance text, not including prompts to choose an option since choosing the wrong option can cost time. Portions of a speedrun that involve waiting around for something with no way to save time, but that don't take control away from the player, do not count because it's possible to lose time by absent-mindedly messing around, which does happen. I chose to count only instances when downtime lasted 5 seconds or longer to keep the data focused on times when a runner can really stop paying attention, and to save myself the trouble of counting a million tiny bits of downtime, like the frames between pressing a button to equip an item from a menu, and that item actually appearing on the HUD and the player regaining control of the cursor. These criteria are just my attempt at a simple, concrete description of what feels like downtime to me when I'm speedrunning. You may disagree with one or more elements of this definition, but any reasonable modification to it would still yield pretty similar results. So we're going with this, though I will discuss it a little bit more at the end. Let's now go through the games one by one to check out the data and some highlights. For each game, I've tallied up downtime for at least 3 speedrun categories based on their current world record. Any %, glitchless any %, with one exception, and at least one more category, usually one that's recently experienced some popularity. I've also compared the downtime to the total length, again of the current world record, to see what percentage of each run is downtime. I'll include a link to my spreadsheet in the description for anyone who wants to take a closer look. Ocarina of Time any % is 22% downtime. Does that seem like a lot? A little? Well, just so you have a point of reference, this is the lowest downtime percentage we'll see in this video. Now you may be wondering, how does a 3 minute and 47 second speedrun of a game with introductory cutscenes that last for nearly 3 minutes end up being only 22% downtime? This is old news at this point, but in 2022, the OOT speedrun community voted to allow intro skip, and since then the vast majority of runs have begun from a file saved in Link's house immediately after the intro cutscenes. Time begins upon taking control of Link, so whether a runner chooses to watch the intro or not, the intro isn't part of the speedrun. If the intro were part of the speedrun, Ocarina of Time any % would be 56% downtime, which makes clear at least part of the appeal of intro skip. The run is left with 5 cutscenes that are 10 seconds long on average. It's hard to say whether there are any cutscene skips or not, because the speedrun skips essentially the entire game, cutscenes and all, with a credits warp. Ocarina of Time has two substantially different glitchless rule sets, and I chose to tally downtime for the one that skips less of the game to contrast the exceptionally short any percent. The current record for glitchless all main quests, or AMQ, is 3 hours and 35 minutes, and it is 48% downtime. This is a lot, but believe me, we're just getting started. That's 1 hour and 46 minutes of downtime per run, which is already well within feature film length territory. I don't know of anyone who actually watches movies during their speedruns and pauses them between the cutscenes, but some people do listen to music, watch other live streams, or otherwise occupy their downtime while doing runs. Also, members of the OOT community have developed a ROM hack called Faster Quest that skips or shortens a lot of cutscenes to reduce downtime. It isn't allowed for leaderboard submissions, but it is useful for practice runs because it reduces the AMQ run length by about 74 minutes. As a glitchless category, all main quests obviously doesn't involve skipping any cutscenes with glitches, but there are some places where runners can make use of cutscenes by overlapping some action with them. For example, in the Fire Temple, runners use Farore's Wind on top of a bombable floor, so that when the floor explodes, Link falls down to the next room during the Farore's Wind animation. Also in the Fire Temple, Link can grab this rising platform before the fight end cutscene begins, allowing him to rise during the cutscene. Another example is getting onto this ladder and dropping to the ground while a gate opens to the Haunted Wasteland. This involves inputs during the cutscene, so not all of the cutscene counted as downtime for my purposes. Optimizations like these aren't unique to glitchless runs, but of course they do crop up more when cutscenes can't be avoided by other means, such as clipping past this gate, or going around it instead of opening it. In fact, there was even a very minor example of this in any percent, where this text outside the shop can be activated during a jump slash or side hop, so Link continues moving while the text begins. Another topic Ocarina of Time downtime brings up is variable length downtime. The downtime durations in my data are based on individual runs that don't necessarily advance text perfectly, so the exact durations of some cutscenes are variable in that sense, but cutscenes can also be variable because of RNG, which is to say random elements. A well-known example is the tower collapse cutscene before the fight with Ganon. The tower spews out rocks randomly as it collapses, so the resulting lag is variable, and a very laggy collapse cutscene can last 2 seconds longer than a less laggy one. Next up is Medallions, Stones, and Trials, or MST for short, which enjoyed a surge of popularity and new records recently. MST is comparable to all main quests in that both categories must beat all the dungeons, beat the trials in Ganon's castle, and defeat Ganon. But with MST not being a glitchless category, runners save a lot of time over AMQ runs with various speed tricks, including cutscene skips. Every post-boss cutscene is skipped, either with a death warp or using Farore's Wind, and some instances result in a wrong warp that skips some overworld movement. Many other cutscenes that appear in all main quests are also skipped or avoided, but since the faster overworld movement and sequence breaks make the non-downtime section shorter as well, MST still comes out to 41% downtime. That's 44 minutes of downtime in a 1 hour and 40 minute run. That's right, the MST record is just under 1 hour and 40 minutes, so it's possible to fit an entire MST run in just the downtime of an all main quests run. Of course, it's also possible to fit 10 any percent runs in just the downtime of an MST run. The longest period of downtime in MST, the Light Arrow cutscene, is long enough by itself to contain an entire any percent run, though doing the two at once would be difficult in practice because there's text to advance in the cutscene. MST takes the idea of doing something useful during cutscenes to the next level. One of my favorite examples is in the Fire Temple, where runners avoid triggering the cutscene with Darunia by keeping him off camera, which involves manipulating the camera with a trade item. The cutscene activates when Darunia is on camera, but the cutscene can be cancelled by pressing a switch to activate another cutscene, and then runners can move around freely as the cutscene plays out to get some convenient bomb drops and even leave the room while Darunia talks. My other favorite example is the super slide during the castle collapse. Super slides continue during cutscenes as long as shield is still held, so Link can slide all the way to the final gate while the previous gate's cutscene plays. I actually checked out 4 categories in total for Ocarina of Time because it was hard to pick just one other category to compare to any percent and glitchless all main quests, since glitched categories in this game are often very different from each other as a result of their differing goals and restrictions. The final OOT category I looked at was Defeat Ganon No SRM, which had lots of activity in 2024 after the discovery of Ganon Floor, a wrong warp to Ganon from Dodongo's Cavern. For my purposes, this category is fairly similar to any percent in that it skips almost the entire game, but relative to any percent there's more downtime added than gameplay, and it comes out to 29% downtime. That's quite the spread. Let's see how Majora's Mask compares. In sharp contrast to Ocarina of Time's intro skip, Majora's Mask has First Cycle. Prior to exiting the clock tower at the beginning of the second 3-day cycle, useful gameplay options are very limited, and there are a bunch of long, unskippable cutscenes. The exact amount of downtime depends on the category, but it's roughly 16 minutes for most categories, all packed into the first 22 minutes or so of the run. Unlike Ocarina of Time, the Majora's Mask community has not implemented an intro skip for the main leaderboard, at least in part because it's impossible to simply save the game after the first cutscene. On the other hand, categories on the extensions leaderboard allow skipping all of First Cycle by starting from a file saved after getting the Deku Mask, and we'll see what effect this has on downtime. Interestingly, any percent doesn't actually complete First Cycle because of a trick called Human in First Cycle. This trick is often also called First Cycle Skip, which is a terribly misleading name because at best the trick only skips the end of First Cycle. The entirety of any percent takes place within First Cycle, so First Cycle certainly isn't skipped, and other categories that use Human in First Cycle save smaller amounts of time with it, and end up finishing First Cycle anyway, cutscenes and all. Simply put, the trick involves a precise clip in the laundry pool to get a mask, which can be used to transform to human, which makes a credits warp possible with some powerful glitches without having to get the Ocarina, Song of Healing, or the Deku Mask. But there's still quite a bit of cutscene prior to even entering Clock Town, so Majora's Mask any percent comes out to 55% downtime, more than any of the 4 Ocarina of Time categories I looked at. Nearly 7 minutes of downtime, or 41% of the current world record's full duration of 16 minutes and 40 seconds, take place prior to gaining control of Link in Clock Town for the first time. So given that the world record can only get shorter and not longer, the overall downtime percentage in this category can never fall below 41%, unless a way to finish the game before entering Clock Town is discovered, or a way to skip or shorten one or more of the intro cutscenes. The any percent glitchless record is just under 2 hours and 40 minutes long, but since it of course needs to beat all the dungeons and do a fair amount in the overworld, we might expect the effect of a cutscene-dense beginning to be mitigated. It is, a little bit. Any percent glitchless is 51% downtime. After all, glitchless can't skip the end of First Cycle cutscenes like any percent can. It needs to watch all of the long giant cutscenes at the ends of dungeons, and the cutscene of playing Oath to Order to get to the moon at the end is nearly 5 minutes long. There are also several fairly long cutscenes along the way when obtaining masks, and at several points in overworld progression. So even with all the added gameplay, a top-level run of this category is still over 50% downtime. That said, over the years, the community has come up with quite a few methods of skipping the Goron Lullaby and getting into Snowhead Temple while the wind is still blowing, and occasionally a method is discovered that doesn't break any rules for glitchless. Yet. Lullaby skip has been done in glitchless runs before, but the method used was later retroactively banned when runners decided that playing Lullaby should be required in glitchless. Then later unbanned when the consensus changed, then eventually rebanned because it turned out that the method subtly involved hovering, which is a glitch. It's kind of a mess. But there's currently a different way to legally skip Lullaby in glitchless runs, and while the current world record doesn't do it because it's very difficult, a new record with it could push the run under 50% downtime, since executing the skip would replace the cutscenes of learning the Lullaby intro, learning the full Lullaby, and playing the Lullaby to put the big Goron to sleep. To these two, let's compare the other main any percent category, any percent no major glitches, or NMG. NMG is a misleading name as used in Majora's Mask, since NMG categories allow a ton of major glitches, like Index Warp, which lets runners warp to owl statues they haven't visited before, and Get Item Manipulation, which is used to get the light arrow from a compass chest without going to Stone Tower Temple, and to get the ocarina back after deleting it in service of skipping the fire arrow. NMG just bans the most major glitches, like the ones used in any percent's credits warp. It's essentially an all dungeons and final boss category, almost like Ocarina of Time's MST without the trials and with fewer glitch restrictions. We saw that MST's glitches let its downtime fall to a lower percentage than the glitchless all main quests, and any percent NMG can also skip a lot of cutscenes, whether by pause buffering all the way through the Happy Mask Salesman's cutscene trigger so it doesn't have a chance to activate, pulling up a stored song text prompt to skip some of the monkey's dialogue, or picking up the boss remains in a very special way to put the remains in the inventory without activating the giant's cutscenes. With all those big cutscene skips, any percent NMG is 58% downtime, 7% higher than any percent glitchless. See, despite being able to skip or avoid a lot of cutscenes, there's no way to skip the very longest cutscenes in the game with this rule set, including the cutscenes of learning and playing Oath to Order, getting the Zora mask, and all 16 minutes of first cycle cutscenes. And while any percent glitchless involves a fair amount of overworld travel, any percent NMG cuts out most of that non-downtime by soaring to owl statues with index warp. While any percent glitchless has a fair amount to do in each dungeon, any percent NMG has very short dungeons, skipping all the boss keys and 3 out of the 4 dungeon items. So although the 4 Ocarina of Time categories I looked at might have indicated that categories might have higher downtime percentages if they have requirements on top of just beating the game, or have restrictions on glitches that can be used to save time, that certainly isn't always the case. And in fact, we'll see that Ocarina of Time is the exception when it comes to glitchless categories. Something that surprised me is that if I only count runtime and downtime after first cycle, as though it were on the category extensions leaderboard, any percent NMG would still be 52% downtime. It's perhaps less surprising that if the Majora's Mask community were to implement an Ocarina of Time style intro skip that eliminated only the 3-minute and 20-second cutscene prior to taking control of Link for the first time in the Lost Woods, the unrestricted any percent would be reduced to 43% downtime. With all of the 3 categories I looked at being over 50% downtime, I was kind of curious as to whether all fairy rewards NMG or any 100% category would break the 50% barrier, since I think what those categories add is more gameplay than cutscene. This seemed especially true for 100% restricted major glitches, the least restricted main 100% category, which uses wrong warps to skip most of the Goron Mask and Zora Mask cutscenes, as well as over 5 minutes of cutscenes involved in getting to the moon from the clock tower. I've been running this category lately, and while there certainly are still some cutscenes, they don't feel nearly as ubiquitous as in other categories I've run, at least after first cycle. So I eventually gave in and tallied downtime for 100% restricted major glitches, and the number I came up with, including all of first cycle, was 36% downtime, which is indeed quite a bit lower than 50%. I suspect this category has the lowest downtime percentage of any main category for Majora's Mask, but I didn't tally all of them, and I don't plan to, as interesting as it might be to compare this to the other 2 main 100% categories. I should mention that the 36% figure is kind of hypothetical. The current world record for restricted major glitches is on an old route that skips fewer cutscenes, so I tallied the downtime in a run of the current route, but compared that downtime to the total length of the record to get 36%. Since the current route is faster than the old route, a new record on the new route of equal quality to the old one would be shorter, and thus have a downtime percentage higher than 36%, but probably only by around 1%. That's all for Majora's Mask. Again, I began this odyssey of data collection because of the Wind Waker glitchless any percent, but as we've seen, it has some stiff competition for cutscene-heavy categories. Let's see how it compares. The Wind Waker any percent speedrun saw some huge developments in late 2024 and 2025, stemming from the discovery of a glitch that allows the Tingle Tuner to be used in Ganon's tower, and the record is now 8 minutes faster than it was before this discovery. I suspected the run might be around 50% downtime prior to the new developments, but I only checked afterward, and the current any percent record is 55% downtime. This category stands out for having the highest mean downtime length of any category I looked at in any game. In the 44-minute run, there are only 26 instances of downtime, but the average length of each instance is 56 seconds, brought up mainly by the 5-minute and 14-second intro, the 4-minute and 14-second cutscene after Forsaken Fortress 2, and the 3-minute and 59-second cutscene before Ganondorf. I won't get into these stats for every single category, but you can find them in my spreadsheet if you want. For reference, the next highest mean downtime lengths across all my data are the Wind Waker any percent no MSS at 41 seconds, and Majora's Mask any percent at 36 seconds. Before I get any further, if you follow the Wind Waker speedrunning, you may be wondering why I'm counting the intro cutscene for the Wind Waker when I chose not to for Ocarina of Time. The Wind Waker community also voted to allow an intro skip in 2022. I went back and forth on this, but I think it's more representative to count the intro in this case, because it's still timed as part of the run, whereas Ocarina of Time's intro is not, and because the odd runner still chooses to watch the intro anyway. If you're interested in stats that disregard the first 3 minutes and 37 seconds of the intro that runners can skip, those also appear in the spreadsheet, but everything I say here in the video will include the intro. Anyway, after any percent and those Majora's Mask categories, it was a little underwhelming to see that glitchless any percent for the Wind Waker is only 46% downtime. But it seems a little less underwhelming looking at the absolute time rather than the percentage. The record is 5 hours and 13 minutes long, and there are 2 hours and 22 minutes of downtime. That is plenty of time for a movie, or if you're feeling more ambitious, running an entire marathon Some highlights of downtime density are the first 28 minutes of the run featuring 21 minutes of downtime, and the end of Forsaken Fortress 2 through Fire and Ice Arrows, including 14 minutes of downtime within the span of 17 minutes. The third category I looked at is any % no MSS, which bans the manual super swim used to escape Outset Island at the beginning of any %, bans skipping Puppet Ganon, and bans actor unloading, which isn't used in any % currently anyway. Not escaping Outset means playing through the exact same cutscene-dense first half hour seen in Glitchless. Not skipping Puppet Ganon means getting a quiver, getting the light arrow, and fighting Puppet Ganon normally, all of which involve some lengthy cutscenes. Honestly, part of my reason for choosing this category to look at was that it seemed awfully cutscene heavy. Any % no MSS is a full 60% downtime, 42 minutes of downtime in an hour and 9-minute run. So what accounts for the Wind Waker runs having so much downtime? Any %, like Majora's Mask any % NMG, does have some cutscene skips, like skipping the cutscene of the Deku Tree spawning the leaf by crush voiding while the cutscene starts, or skipping the Puppet Ganon intro cutscene by voiding after hitting the load zone for 1 frame with storage. One of my favorite cutscene skips is a very minor one, deactivating the Spicoblin's intro cutscene by hitting it first from outside the cutscene trigger. But also like Majora's Mask any % NMG, the longest cutscenes can't be skipped, or at least shouldn't be in any %. The long cutscene at the end of Forsaken Fortress 2 is skippable, and it even is skipped in all dungeons runs, but since any % doesn't beat Tower of the Gods, it needs to watch that cutscene to get to Hyrule. The long cutscene before Ganondorf is also technically skippable, and it is skipped in low %, but this involves an actor unloading sequence that takes longer than watching the cutscene does. Twilight Princess marks a turning point in 2 ways that will affect downtime quite a bit. It's the first game in the series to make some cutscenes skippable with a simple button press, but it's also the first game in the series to have area load times that are often 5 seconds long or longer when added to the animations of Link exiting the previous area and entering the new area, meaning they count as downtime. Twilight Princess any % comes out to 40% downtime, but I wouldn't be surprised if it had been upwards of 50% downtime like the Wind Waker any % if long cutscenes like the Interloper's cutscene, the Sage's cutscene, and the Puppet Zelda cutscene weren't skippable with 2 easy start presses. This category includes only 1 instance of downtime lasting longer than 2 minutes, that being the Master Sword cutscene, as opposed to the previous game's cutscenes lengths reaching 3, 4, and even 5 minutes. There are still a few cutscenes in the 1 to 2 minute range though, those being Squidna, Argorok's death, Entering City in the Sky, and Morpheal's death. Interestingly, Morpheal's death cutscene is actually variable length, not because of variable lag like Ocarina of Time's collapse cutscene, but because Morpheal needs to bonk a certain point on the wall during the cutscene, and the amount of time it takes to swim there depends on its trajectory and position in the arena at the end of the fight. The longest recorded Morpheal death cutscene is about 5 seconds longer than the shortest. Cutscenes in this game behave this way in general, with starting conditions affecting how the cutscene plays out. For instance, the intro cutscene for Phantom Zant makes Link put his sword away, but he can't start putting his sword away if he's in the process of taking it out, so starting to pull the sword just before hitting the cutscene trigger and then skipping the cutscene right away leaves the sword out at the beginning of the fight. That example is only really relevant for tassing, but another example that's actually used to save time in RTA speedruns is shortening Po 1's flame cutscene. After Po 1 dies, the game plays a cutscene of its flame slowly flying to the torch by the stairs. Intuitively, the length of this cutscene depends on how far Po 1 is from the torch when it dies, and taking a moment to lure Po 1 over to the stairs before killing it can net a 2-second time save by shortening the cutscene. This is useful in a category like Glitchless any % that isn't allowed to skip Po 1, and this is my segue into saying that Glitchless any % is a mere 31% downtime. This is the lowest percentage we've seen outside of the 2 very short Ocarina of Time categories, though again, you might get a different impression when I point out that that's an hour and 40 minutes of downtime over a 5-hour and 19-minute run. Still, that's 42 minutes less downtime than the similar length the Wind Waker Glitchless any %, and I personally can really feel the difference when doing runs. By the way, Twilight Princess has 2 glitchless rule sets just like Ocarina of Time does, but unlike in Ocarina of Time where the rule sets are different enough that the records for the 2 glitchless any % are an hour and a half apart, the 2 Twilight Princess rule sets are nearly identical, and the records are only 6 minutes apart. So I just tallied downtime for JP Glitchless, the rule set that I like better. The third category I checked here is all mirror shards, which isn't a full game category. It starts after the first 3 dungeons and ends after the 4 mirror shard dungeons. It's a fun category, and I chose it just to have a shorter category contrasting any percent and glitchless any percent being around 3 and 5 hours long, respectively. But the 1 hour and 13-minute all mirror shards is 37% downtime, and I can't think of anything noteworthy to say about that, so I won't. But I did want to discuss the inclusion of area loads in downtime a little bit, because I think it's a debatable aspect of my definition of downtime. I stand by their inclusion, but I also recognize that how long loads feel while I'm doing a run depends a lot on what I'm used to at the moment. When I run Twilight Princess after having run Majora's Mask for a while, I wonder whether my game has crashed every time I warp to Lake Hylia. And when I switch to Majora's Mask from Twilight Princess, especially with a new category, I occasionally have trouble thinking ahead to what I need to do in the next area because loads are so short. Skyward Sword generally has slightly longer loads and door animations than Twilight Princess, so I suspect a longtime Skyward Sword runner would find Twilight Princess loads to be quick, and I can only imagine what a Switch Zelda runner would feel like coming from what I feel are extremely long loads. It's possible someone with a different speedrunning background would have chosen to only count downtime over 7 seconds long, or 10 seconds, or 3 seconds. In the end though, it doesn't make a huge difference. If I remove all the loads from the downtime for Twilight Princess glitchless any percent, it only drops from 31% to 29% downtime. Incidentally, this kind of approximates what glitchless any percent's downtime would be if played on the Wii version, since TP Wii load times are faster and often under 5 seconds long. Anyway, the most common method of reducing downtime in Twilight Princess runs, other than pressing start twice, is avoiding cutscenes rather than canceling or interrupting them. For instance, glitchless runs roll around to the stairs in Forest Temple rather than watching an extra cutscene of a monkey swinging onto the rope. And most glitched runs use a super jump to skip Death Sword even though fighting Death Sword is pretty quick, because the cutscene of Death Sword dying takes a while. Any percent skips the cutscene of Plum explaining his minigame by going around the trigger, though we still howl at the grass inside the trigger afterwards, which must be done in a particular way to avoid activating the cutscene. There are still some ways to cancel unskippable cutscenes with glitches, but they're not common. For instance, a glitch called Item Wheel Delay makes it possible to pause and save warp during a cutscene, skipping any of it that's left. The next any percent task will probably use this to skip the Squidna cutscene, but unless we figure out a new way to do it, you won't see this trick in non-task runs because it requires sustaining 30 inputs per second frame perfectly for upwards of a minute. Like Twilight Princess, Skyward Sword's loads are usually over 5 seconds long, though this time door opening animations usually are as well, and some cutscenes can be skipped just by holding a button, reducing the number of cutscenes worth skipping via other means. Perhaps unsurprisingly, the 4 Skyward Sword categories I looked at ranged from 32% to 44% downtime, basically the same as the range for the Twilight Princess categories I looked at. This was the exception to my MO of tallying downtime in each game's glitchless category because Skyward Sword doesn't have a glitchless category. The closest option was any percent no back in time, which has some glitches, some big sequence breaks, and another sequence break so big that it makes the other big sequence breaks seem like small sequence breaks. But it's still mostly glitchless, and I expect a fully glitchless run would have a similar downtime percentage. With the reasonable assumption that a hypothetical glitchless any percent run wouldn't add over an hour of runtime to any percent no back in time without adding any downtime, glitchless any percent would still have a higher downtime percentage than any percent, which is notable because that hasn't been the case in the 3 games since Ocarina of Time. So how does Skyward Sword any percent have so little downtime? As the existence of an any percent no back in time category implies, back in time is a very powerful glitch. In short, back in time involves playing on the title and file select screen, performing certain actions that set certain flags in memory, and applying those flags to a file to tell the game that that file has already done something in the overworld or a dungeon that it hasn't really done. There's much more to it than that, but what's relevant here is that it can be used to skip enormous chunks of the game, some of which involve major cutscenes. But what's counterintuitive is that back in time sequences involve quite a few loads and cutscenes themselves, sometimes even leading to watching a single cutscene multiple times in one run, which I think is very funny. The thing is, none of the cutscenes during back in time sequences are downtime. In back in time, the runner never loses control of the pointer and can always interact with the file select screen, which means that even though there are periods during cutscenes in back in time where a runner doesn't need to do anything, the runner can lose time by not doing nothing. I've never personally done a Skyward Sword run with back in time before, but I asked a few Skyward Sword runners who have whether cutscenes in back in time feel like downtime to them, and they said that it depends on the cutscene. In many cases, they're still selecting or copying files during cutscenes in back in time, sometimes with tight timing, or anticipating upcoming menuing by aiming the pointer at the right place in advance. Exceptions for these runners include longer familiar cutscenes and cutscenes that involve waiting for a queue, but still none of this counts towards my definition of downtime for this video. With the current any% record spending a whopping 34% of its duration in Back in Time, one might then expect the total downtime to be very low, but each of the 13 instances of Back in Time in any% does have some downtime component, because Back in Time is activated by dying and resetting, which means waiting for the continue prompt to appear, waiting for the console to reset, and eventually reloading the run file at the end of the sequence. And coincidentally, this ends up balancing out to keep the total downtime percentage similar to Twilight Princess's. Now, although the sequence breaks achieved through Back in Time skip most of the cutscenes in the game indirectly by skipping most of the game, much like Ocarina of Time or Majora's Mask any%, there are some more direct cutscene skips as well, like this awkward jump to skip some text from Horwell, this 2-frame window side hop to skip the long wing ceremony cutscene, and these jumps while severing the ropes in Earth Temple that skip the cutscenes of the bridge falling. There's also an interesting case of variable length cutscenes. The exit doors from boss rooms glow on and off in a cycle, and they can only start their opening animations once the player has pressed A and then the glow has reached its minimum intensity. This means that pressing A to open a door while the glow is already diminishing results in a shorter cutscene than pressing A while the glow is intensifying. One notable stat is Skyward Sword any%'s mean downtime length of 11.1 seconds, the second lowest after Ocarina of Time any%'s 10.1 seconds. Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword's mean downtime lengths are brought down by their loads counting as very short downtime, so this partially reflects how many instances of downtime are just loads. But the longest instance of downtime in Skyward Sword Harp and any% is the cutscene of placing the ruby tablet, which is only 43 seconds long. The only category I checked whose longest instance of downtime is shorter than that is again Ocarina of Time any% at 15 seconds. By virtue of its being near the end of the list, there won't be many new ideas to explore regarding downtime in Breath of the Wild. Many cutscenes are intentionally skippable, like in Twilight Princess and Skyward Sword. While there are fewer loads, they've gotten even longer, with one warp taking 25 seconds, and some loads like those into Temple of Time and Dark Beast Ganon can vary in length by multiple seconds. Timing begins on taking control of Link after the opening cutscene, a little over a minute after starting a new file, which is just like Ocarina of Time's intro skip in terms of downtime during the speedrun, and as far as my stats are concerned, despite the fact that runners still need to close the game, reopen the game, start a new file, and watch the opening cutscene every attempt. Part of the reason behind this rule is relevant here as well. Preloading is loading an area on some file prior to starting a run, so that the area loads faster when it's reached during the run. Preloading would reduce downtime during runs, but the community has understandably banned it, and the requirement of closing out of the game between attempts prevents it from occurring. But downtime can be reduced in some more active ways anyway. Any% clips out of the Shrine of Resurrection, avoiding the long cutscenes of opening the exit and reading the title of the game. Clipping into the shrines not only skips the short cutscenes of opening them normally, but also makes it possible to skip activating the tower, which involves over 2 minutes of downtime. Aside from 2 extra warps that are used in bug limit any%, the glitchless category, these skipped cutscenes constitute the only difference in downtime between any% and bug limit any%. But, reinforcing the trend seen in Majora's Mask, The Wind Waker, and Twilight Princess, bug limit any% is still only 41% downtime to any%'s 44%. Counteracting over 4.5 minutes of additional downtime are 12 additional minutes of total runtime, and it's pretty much just because something like this is not quite as fast as something like this. Since the dungeons aren't even supposed to be required in this game, not even bug limit any% enters any of them, so I chose all dungeons as the third category to check out. The story sequences leading up to the dungeons involve some serious cutscenes, including one of the crown jewels of Breath of the Wild downtime, fish drama. The 8 minutes just before taking control of Link in Vah Ruta contain 6 minutes and 44 seconds of fish, in the parlance of our times, yapping. The longest instances of downtime in any% and bug limit any% are 72 seconds exiting the first shrine and 79 seconds raising the tower, respectively. But each dungeon in all dungeons is preceded by a cutscene around that length. A really cool cutscene, mind you. But in a speedrun, that's downtime. All dungeons comes out to 51% downtime. I'm probably the first person to point out that Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom have some similarities, and comparing the two may be of interest. Any% for both games does 4 shrines in the tutorial area and then goes straight to the final boss, with the glitchless version following the same structure but with slower overworld travel, and all dungeons involving quite a few more cutscenes. Breath of the Wild any percent was 44% downtime, and Tears of the Kingdom any percent is 56% downtime. If you've played the game, you can probably guess why. The intro is so dense with unskippable cutscenes that community discussion of allowing skipping the intro began the day the game came out. Throughout this video, I've mentioned a few times how many runs of one category could fit in the downtime of another category, but the longest individual intro cutscene in Tears of the Kingdom lasts nearly 4 minutes without any required inputs whatsoever, so a runner could truly do a full Ocarina of Time any percent run while waiting it out. Given this state of affairs, around 2 months after the game came out, the community voted to allow starting runs from a save in the Room of Awakening after all the intro cutscenes and with 6 minutes and 40 seconds on the timer. And all that downtime was never seen again. The end. Until 1 week later, when an out-of-bounds clip was discovered that saves around a minute prior to the longest intro cutscene, motivating runners who didn't want to sacrifice a minute not to use intro skip after all. Since then, there have been a few more stages of variations of intro skip being allowed, at times restricted from use in certain categories that would be affected by starting from the same file every time, and at present allowed in all categories either via a game mod that skips the longest cutscene, or by playing up to that cutscene on a new file and then loading a different file saved after that cutscene, with exact timing offset determined by method and game version. Where I'm going with all of this is that I'm counting the full intro in my data because it would be complicated not to. Of the current records in the 3 categories I'm looking at, one uses the newest intro skip that omits only the long cutscene with a timer offset of 3 minutes and 23 seconds. One uses the original intro skip with a timer offset of 6 minutes and 40 seconds. And the third doesn't skip the intro at all, which of course is the preference of some runners. Besides, the length of the intro is always included in the total run length, whether it's skipped or not, so it's part of the speedrun in that sense. And double besides, all of this might change when people are doing runs on Switch too. I really should have finished this video months ago. Anyway, at least for the time being and including the intro, Tears of the Kingdom any percent is 56% downtime, despite the tricks and routing that cut out some downtime. There's the aforementioned intro clip that cuts out about 1.5 minutes of cutscenes. There's Cog Skip Skip, which skips a 35-second cutscene of activating the cogs. There's talking to this construct from aboard a wing to receive the battery in 10 seconds to avoid getting it automatically after the Fuse Shrine, which takes 29 seconds. And there's the Boss Rush Skip, which skips 2.5 minutes of boss cutscenes. Also, the bosses. In comparison, Glitchless any percent has about 4.5 more minutes of downtime than any percent, including 36 seconds of ascending over the course of the run. Tears of the Kingdom Glitchless any percent is only 42% downtime, again on account of the likes of this, taking longer than the likes of this. This puts the Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom Glitchless any percents within 1% downtime of each other. I was honestly kind of surprised to find that Tears of the Kingdom All Dungeons is only 55% downtime. I was initially surprised to find that it was only 48% downtime until I realized I'd entered a number wrong in my spreadsheet and had a cutscene in there that was negative 10 minutes long. That's a little over 2 any percent runs that can fit in just the downtime of an All Dungeons run. The dungeons themselves are all very cutscene heavy, with the Construct Factory Spirit Temple combination including over 6 minutes of downtime on its own. This ascend near the end of the run lasts for 9 seconds, and we're going to watch it together. But there is of course plenty of gameplay, and some long bits of overworld travel to balance out the downtime. And that's all the 3D Zeldas, at least as of today. At the end of the video, I'll show leaderboards of the categories I looked at with the most downtime, and the categories with the least downtime. But now that we've checked out the data, I want to discuss what any of it means outside of the raw numbers, or really, what it doesn't mean. In my opinion, all of this is just trivia. I tallied all this downtime because I was curious, and I'm sharing it because other people might be curious as well. The intended outcome is for you to finish this video and go, huh. I don't mean to give the impression that downtime percentage is the most important factor in whether people enjoy watching a speedrun or performing a speedrun. Given the option to skip a game's intro without invalidating a run, some runners still prefer not to for various reasons. And for runners who do skip intros, it's not like all downtime is excruciating. Speaking for myself, I do mind when there's a glut of cutscenes right at the beginning of a run if I plan to do multiple attempts in one session, which is why I usually skip first cycle when I run Majora's Mask. But I'm closer to neutral towards cutscenes towards the middle of a run, which occasionally even feel like a nice break in the action. And cutscenes towards the end of a run usually don't bother me at all. For instance, the Snow Peak Ruins individual level any % speedrun is about 7 minutes long and ends with nearly 2 minutes of downtime, but since the only gameplay after those 2 minutes is one roll, I already know what my final time will be going into the cutscene, so I just don't watch it if I don't want to finish the run. Cutscenes like Squidna in Twilight Princess or playing Oath to Order in Majora's Mask can even be exciting for someone excited about the end of the run, whether runner or viewer. As I mentioned earlier, I suspect that every runner gets used to the flow of downtime in their speedrun if they do it enough times, and that downtime can feel perfectly natural as opportunities to think ahead to the next part of the run without feeling like watching a movie. I feel like I always prefer playing rather than waiting, but I wonder how I would feel doing a speedrun of substantial length that was something like 10% downtime, or lower. Maybe I would wish there were some breaks. I also want to emphasize that for any speedrun, or at least any of the speedruns I've touched on today, having a lot of downtime in no way devalues the parts that aren't downtime, which can still be fun and have a high skill ceiling. People do keep pushing their skill even in runs that are 50 or 60% downtime because they enjoy it. Part of the reason the downtime percentage in any of these categories has gotten as high as it is because runners have continually worked at optimizing the parts that can be optimized to get faster and faster times. That's the whole point. Speaking of which, recall that all of my data in this video are from world records. Most other runs done of the world record route for any of these categories will have lower downtime percentages because they're done more slowly. The exception, I suppose, being runs whose main time losses are failing or not attempting cutscene skips. Finally, let's talk about some things my dataset doesn't capture. It's accurate, or accurate enough, in capturing my definition of downtime, though for the sake of my own sanity, I started rounding downtime to the nearest second after Ocarina of Time, and I often copied and pasted numbers for the length of the same cutscene across multiple categories of the same game, even if the categories were run in different languages. When long sets of text boxes included a prompt in the middle that I wouldn't count as downtime, I just took down the total length of the dialogue and subtracted 1 second. These imperfections have a negligible impact on the results. Something my dataset wasn't meant to capture but that would interest me is an idea of how downtime percentage has changed over time for one category of one game due to route changes and trick discoveries. I'm never going to do that study, but if someone does for some reason, I'll watch their video and say, huh. While making this video, I've identified two main things that my definition of downtime fails to capture. The first is a pair of gray areas. I mentioned earlier that not needing to do anything doesn't necessarily qualify as downtime as long as you also need to not do something, which keeps things simple. If you have control of Link, it's definitely not downtime. But there certainly are some parts of speedruns excluded by this definition that I'd understand someone else's definition of downtime including. For instance, waiting 30 seconds for the clock tower door to open, or sinking 30 seconds down to Morpheal, or hanging from a ledge for 45 seconds to escape Girahim 3, or riding a wing for 1 minute and 20 seconds to Hyrule Castle. The totally subjective reason that I don't count this kind of thing as downtime is that, for me personally, having control of Link is always enough to make it feel like I'm really playing, whatever that means. It also would have been more difficult to tally that kind of thing. A related gray area is downtime that doesn't feel much like downtime because some input needs to be given immediately after the downtime ends. For example, in Twilight Princess, it's common to have 1 frame for input between 2 periods where inputs do nothing, such as cutscenes or text boxes. It's often possible to save time with inputs on these frames, so runners often mash particular inputs for particular 1-framers to try to save that time, and the mashing begins during the preceding downtime. Even in cases where runners time 1-framers instead of mashing and aren't doing any inputs beforehand, we're focused and paying attention so we don't miss our cues. Gorge Void in any %, for instance, is a 1-framer that saves over a minute, so focusing on a visual cue during the cutscene leading up to it doesn't feel like downtime, at least in the same way that a typical cutscene does, but it counts as downtime for the purposes of this video. The other thing my definition doesn't capture is much more interesting: text mashing. If you're a speedrunner, your eyebrows may have risen when I implied earlier that mashing text can be done absent-mindedly. This topic really could merit its own video, but I'll try to keep it brief. Twilight Princess has the most mindless text mashing. For slow text boxes, A or B will clear a text box after it's filled itself, and for fast text boxes, B still only clears, but A either finishes filling the text box in 1 frame, or clears the text box if it's already filled. Outside of prompts where a B press can choose a no option, this means that optimal text mashing is always frame-perfectly alternating between A and B. In theory, this leads to totally mindless text mashing, but in practice, even this simple system involves some attention. Trying to mash 2 buttons at 15 Hz each for an entire cutscene is way more strenuous than resting between sets of text boxes, and runners who are conscious of this time their bursts of mashing to fit the dialogue. This system also goes for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, only with A and B reversed, though because fast text boxes in those games take longer than 1 frame to become clearable, and longer than 1 frame to clear after the clear input, tapping only B at the right pace is a more practical way of advancing text optimally. The Wind Waker also has a similar system. Advancing text is just like Twilight Princess, except that 1 B press to clear a text box will also fill the next text box if it's fast text, whereas A still only clears or fills, but can't do both with 1 press. So these systems of advancing text involve paying some amount of attention, but the method of advancing text when it needs advancing is pretty much always the same. Not so for Skyward Sword, Majora's Mask, or Ocarina of Time though. In Skyward Sword, pressing A clears filled text boxes, but the only way to make text boxes fill faster is to hold A. Advancing text optimally then means holding A until 2 frames before a text box is clearable, then releasing for a frame, then repressing A on the next frame. Of course, not all text mashing must be executed frame perfectly, but this means that runners who want to play as optimally as possible need to pay attention to the length of every single text box, so they know how long to hold A before repressing it. Majora's Mask has the most complex system. A third button, C up, can be used to clear filled text boxes. A and B each fill fast text boxes in 1 frame, or clear them if they're already filled, but the N64 Zeldas introduce a new fast text mechanic. Whereas individual fast text boxes must be cleared after being filled as normal, pressing B to fill a fast text box that's in a set of other fast text boxes also clears it and all but the last of the following fast text boxes in the set, which is very fast. On the other hand, pressing A to fill and advance text boxes in this same context makes them act like individual fast text boxes, which requires 2 inputs per text box and is slower. There's actually a third common type of text box as well that fills itself in 1 frame automatically, but every frame that the B button is pressed prior to the text appearing prevents the text box from becoming closable on the next frame, meaning mashing B at these text boxes can cost time and even indefinitely prolong the text box if it's mashed at 20 Hz. This means that advancing text optimally in some parts of Majora's Mask that I've counted as downtime isn't actually trivial. Talking to the owl before learning Song of Soaring is a good example. The owl has 9 sets of text boxes. It's exclusively fast text, but the 1st, 3rd, 6th, and 7th sets have multiple fast text boxes in a row, so advancing those with B is optimal. But the other sets are individual fast text boxes, so it's better to advance those by mashing A and B. Ocarina of Time's text mashing is almost identical, except that the A button has the same functionality as the C up button, so the system is slightly simpler. I stand by my inclusion of text mashing in downtime for the purposes of this video, but it was a more difficult decision than might be apparent to someone who hasn't speedrun these games. Alright, here are those leaderboards for highest and lowest downtime percentages of the categories I looked at. I briefly entertained the idea of calling back to the end of my Puzzle Jingles video by closing on a montage of every piece of downtime in the Wind Waker glitchless any %, but no, I'm not doing that. You're welcome.